My name is Ava Holloway, and the first time I realized my family had already buried me in their hearts was the day my grandmother died, and no one called me until after the funeral was over. I was 32 years old, standing in the stockroom of a home decor store in Portland, unpacking chipped ceramic candle holders, when I noticed I had 7 missed calls from my cousin Rachel and 1 voicemail from my Aunt Denise. I remember wiping dust off my hands before pressing play, thinking maybe someone needed help with medical paperwork or a bank password, because that's what I had always been in that family when they remembered I existed, useful but never central. Instead, I heard my aunt's voice, dry and controlled, like she was reading a weather report. Your grandmother passed 2 days ago. The service was this morning. We assumed you wouldn't want to come after everything. The will has been read. Please don't create a scene. I just stood there staring at the shelves while the room seemed to tilt. My grandmother, Eleanor Holloway, was the only person in that family who ever looked at me like I was enough. She used to tell me, "Some people inherit money, Ava. Others inherit silence. Learn which one your family is handing you." At the time, I thought she was being poetic. I didn't know she was warning me. I called Rachel back with hands that were already shaking. She answered on the second ring and sounded irritated, not guilty. "Why are you blowing up my phone?" she asked. And I nearly laughed because that was exactly the kind of cruelty my family had perfected over the years, making my pain sound inconvenient. "Grandma died," I said, "and you let me find out from voicemail after her funeral." Rachel exhaled like I was exhausting her. "Ava, come on. You moved away years ago. You were never around. Grandma was sick for months." I gripped the edge of a metal shelf so hard it dug into my palm. "You knew she called me every Sunday." Rachel went quiet for half a second before saying, "Anyway, it doesn't matter now." She left the house to Mom, the lake cabin to Uncle Peter. The jewelry was divided already. "You're getting a small trust distribution. So please don't start telling people you were robbed." That word robbed hit me like a slap, not because she said it, but because I hadn't even mentioned money. They had. That's when I knew this had been planned long before I heard her voice. People don't defend themselves that fast unless they're already standing on guilty ground. By the time my shift ended, I had replayed every conversation I'd had with Grandma over the last year, looking for the moment I might have missed the truth. She had sounded tired sometimes, yes, but never confused, never distant. And she had repeated one thing to me again and again, in those final months. "When the time comes, don't let them rush you past paper. Paper tells the truth when people won't." I drove home through cold rain with that sentence echoing in my head. My apartment was small and quiet, the kind of place you choose when you stop believing anyone will be dropping by. I sat at my kitchen table with takeout I never opened and stared at the family group chat where no one had mentioned her death, only posted funeral flowers and vague messages about legacy and peace, as if grief could be staged like a holiday photo. Then Rachel uploaded a picture from the reading of the will. She was smiling in cream cashmere beside my Aunt Denise, both of them holding glasses of champagne in Grandma's dining room. My stomach turned. That room had seen Christmas mornings, whispered advice. My grandmother slipping me $20 bills in folded napkins because she knew my mother would borrow my birthday money and forget to return it. And now they were celebrating in it like victors standing over a battlefield. If you're listening this far and you've ever felt like the people who should have loved you most treated you like an afterthought, I want you to stay with me. Some stories don't begin with shouting. Sometimes they begin with the cold, polished voice of someone telling you your grief is badly timed. If you've known that kind of pain, leave your thoughts below, because I know I'm not the only one. 3 days later, I drove to Willow Creek, the town I had spent my whole childhood trying to escape and my whole adulthood trying not to miss. The Holloway family home sat on a hill above the lake. White columns, black shutters, everything meant to signal history and stability. But old houses are like old families. If you know where to look, the cracks were always there. My Aunt Denise opened the door before I knocked twice, her mouth already tight. "This is not a good time." I looked past her into the foyer where framed portraits of dead relatives stared down like judges. "It wasn't a good time when you buried my grandmother without telling me either." Her face hardened. "Lower your voice." I stepped inside anyway. In the parlor, Rachel sat on the sofa scrolling through her phone in a black dress that still had the boutique tag string hanging from the sleeve. Uncle Peter stood by the fireplace pretending to look solemn. Though the decanter on the side table suggested morning had become social drinking, no one hugged me. No one said they were sorry. Aunt Denise simply handed me a copy of the will as though it should settle everything. I read it once, then twice, and something in me went cold. Grandma Eleanor, a woman meticulous enough to label freezer soup by date and to keep tax records from the 1980s, had apparently signed a will 6 weeks before her death, leaving nearly everything to my Aunt Denise, her son Peter, and Rachel. I was mentioned in one line, a modest monthly trust, in recognition of emotional distance and limited involvement in family affairs. Emotional distance. I could hear Denise's phrasing all over it. My grandmother never spoke like that. She was plain-spoken, warm, occasionally savage, but never sterile. And then I saw the witness signatures. One of them belonged to Martin Keene, the attorney who had handled Holloway family documents for years. The other was a private nurse I had never heard of. "When was this signed?" I asked. Denise crossed her arms. "You can read." "I'm asking who was in the room." Rachel looked up. "Oh my God, Ava. Are you seriously doing this?" I ignored her. "Did Grandma ask for me?" No one answered. Uncle Peter poured himself another drink. That silence told me more than any confession would have. I folded the will carefully and slipped it into my bag. Aunt Denise stepped closer. "Don't embarrass yourself. Eleanor was disappointed in you." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not grief but fear wearing expensive lipstick. "No," I said quietly. "I think she was disappointed in all of you." For the first time Rachel stood up, anger flashing across her face. "You always do this. You disappear for years, then come back acting like the injured one." I laughed once, bitter and sharp. I disappeared? Or was I pushed so far to the edge of this family that I finally stopped begging to be let back in? No one had an answer for that either. I walked out with the will in my purse and my grandmother's last warning burning in my ears. "Don't let them rush you past paper." That night, alone in a motel off Highway 9, because no one invited me to stay in the family home I grew up in, I unfolded the will again under yellow lamplight. On the final page, tucked so neatly into the fold that I almost missed it, was a tiny square of stationery, cream-colored, with my grandmother's handwriting in faint blue ink. It only had 8 words on it. "This is not my final letter. Find Clara." I stared at it until dawn. There are moments in life when your body understands danger before your mind catches up, and reading those 8 words felt exactly like that. I knew my grandmother's handwriting as well as my own. She used to send me birthday cards with long looping A's and tiny slanted R's that made even ordinary sentences look elegant. That note was hers, not similar, not close, hers. Which meant one thing none of them were expecting. Grandma knew something was wrong before she died. Maybe not every detail, but enough to leave me a trail. I turned that paper over 5 times, hoping there would be more, but there was only her name embossed in the corner and those words. "Find Clara." I didn't sleep. I sat cross-legged on the motel bed while trucks passed outside, and I tried to remember anyone by that name connected to my grandmother. The answer came just before sunrise. Clara Bennett. Grandma's longtime housekeeper and companion before Aunt Denise pushed her out 2 years earlier under the excuse of budget concerns. Budget concerns in a family that spent more on one fundraising dinner than Clara probably earned in 6 months. By 8 the next morning, I was in my car driving toward the outskirts of town, where I vaguely remembered Clara had moved after leaving the Holloway house. She lived in a narrow blue bungalow with wind chimes on the porch and flower pots that looked cared for, even in winter. When she opened the door, she froze for a moment, hand over her heart. "Ava?" she said softly. And something about the way she said my name nearly broke me because it sounded like recognition, not inconvenience. I hugged her before I could stop myself, and she hugged me back like someone who had been carrying her own grief alone. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon tea and furniture polish. Clara sat me down at her kitchen table and studied my face with deep, careful eyes. "They told me you didn't come because you didn't want to upset the family." I let out a hollow laugh. "That sounds like them." Clara's mouth tightened. Your grandmother asked for you twice in her final week. Denise said you were unreachable. I stared at her. That's a lie. My phone never changed. Clara nodded slowly, like she had expected that answer, and hated it anyway. Then I showed her the note. The moment she saw my grandmother's handwriting, her eyes filled. She got up without a word and went to a cabinet above the sink, reaching into the very back. When she returned, she held a sealed envelope with my name on it. Not typed, written. She gave this to me 6 months ago, Clara whispered. She said if anything happened and things didn't feel right, I was to wait until you found me. She didn't trust the house anymore. Said too many drawers were being opened when she wasn't the one opening them. I took the envelope so carefully it felt like handling something alive. My fingers trembled so badly, I had to set it on the table before opening it. Read it, Clara said. So I did. The letter inside was dated 4 months before Grandma's death. In it, she wrote plainly, exactly as I remembered her voice sounding, not like the cold legal language in the will. She said she had changed parts of her estate plan after discovering dishonesty close to home, though she didn't name names. She said she feared pressure, manipulation, and selective truth-telling from family members who had begun monitoring her calls, medications, and visitors. Then came the line that made my skin go cold. If you are reading a will that paints you as absent, uncaring, or emotionally distant, that document was not created in freedom. I had to stop there and breathe because my hands were numb. Clara reached over and squeezed my wrist. I kept reading. Grandma wrote that there was another letter, along with documents, stored in a safety deposit box at First Harbor Bank in Portland, under a co-access agreement that included my name, activated only upon her death. I looked up so fast the room seemed to blur. She never told me that. Clara nodded. She told me she didn't want to tell you unless she had to. She hoped the family would do the right thing without forcing you into a war. But families like mine rarely do the right thing when money, image, and control are all sitting at the same table. By noon, I was back in Portland, still wearing yesterday's clothes, clutching that letter as if someone might try to snatch it from me at a stoplight. At First Harbor Bank, a manager with silver glasses and practiced discretion led me into a private office after checking the death notice and my ID 3 separate times. Your grandmother prepared this years ago and updated the contents 8 months back, he told me. We were instructed to release them only after official notice of her death. He placed the box in front of me and stepped out. Inside were copies of earlier wills, handwritten letters, bank statements, a USB drive, and most important of all, a notarized amendment naming me as executor of a charitable property trust tied to the lake cabin and adjacent land. Not heir to all of it, no. Grandma was too smart to make things easy for anyone. But it gave me standing, legal standing. Enough to challenge the newer will and force discovery. There was also one more letter. This one was addressed simply, for Ava, when the truth gets ugly. I read it right there in the bank with tears blurring the page. She told me she loved me, that she knew I had spent years shrinking around people who mistook gentleness for weakness, and that I must not confuse peace with surrender. She admitted she had overheard arguments between Denise and Martin Keene, the family attorney, about capacity, timing, and final signatures. She wrote that if Denise ever tried to claim she had been disoriented or easily led, I should remember this. A woman does not forget who loved her. She forgets where she set her glasses. Those are not the same thing. Even through my heartbreak, I laughed through my tears because that was exactly her, wise and wicked in one sentence. I walked out of the bank into pale winter sunlight, feeling something I hadn't felt in years when it came to my family. Not sadness, not yet. Clarity. I called the first probate litigator I found through a referral from the bank's legal contact, a woman named Joanna Price, with a voice so steady it made me feel steadier just hearing it. I met her 2 hours later in her downtown office, all glass walls and thick case files. She read the letters, scanned the trust documents, and asked almost no dramatic questions. Just the right ones. Did your grandmother's contact with you change suddenly? Yes. Who controlled access near the end? Denise, mostly. Was there anyone excluded from the funeral or the will reading besides you? Not that I knew of. Joanna leaned back in her chair and tapped the newer will. This doesn't smell right, she said. And judges don't like documents that smell wrong. I almost smiled. Can we stop them? She held my gaze. We can challenge them. But Ava, I need you ready for what that means. Discovery. Depositions. Your family turning every absence, every move, every private hurt into public narrative. I thought about the funeral I missed, the fake sympathy, the champagne picture in Grandma's dining room. They already made it public, I said. I'm just done being quiet. If this story is hitting something real in you, stay with me. Sometimes the moment your life changes isn't when you cry. It's when you stop apologizing for seeing what's right in front of you. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping family comfortable and telling the truth, I'd truly love to know how you handled it. That evening, Joanna filed an emergency notice to preserve estate records and freeze distribution of certain assets until the court reviewed the challenge. By 9 p.m., Rachel was calling me for the first time in years with actual urgency in her voice. I let it ring twice before answering. What did you do? She snapped. No hello. No pretense. Interesting, I said, sitting at my kitchen counter with Grandma's letter open beside me. You all were fine when I was the last to know she died. But the second a judge gets involved, now I'm family again? Rachel swore under her breath. Mom says you found Clara. There it was. Fear. Quiet. Sharp. Unmistakable. I looked at the rain on my window and said the one sentence I had waited my whole life to say to that family without my voice trembling. Tell your mother I found more than that. Then I hung up. The first official response from my family came 48 hours later. And it was exactly what Joanna predicted. Calm on the surface, vicious underneath. Denise's attorney sent a letter accusing me of emotional instability, opportunism, and a long pattern of financial dependence disguised as sentiment. Joanna read it once, snorted, and slid it across her desk toward me. This is what weak cases do early. They try to make you feel ashamed before the facts get examined. I wish I could say I was above being affected by it, but the truth is, words still have power when they come from people who taught you how to doubt yourself before you were old enough to defend against it. My mother died when I was 9, and after that, Aunt Denise became the unofficial female authority in my life. She didn't raise me exactly, she edited me. The clothes I wore were too plain. The way I laughed was too loud. The things I cared about were too impractical. My hurt was too dramatic. My silence too moody. Every version of me was somehow wrong, until I learned to offer a smaller version just to keep the room calm. So yes, reading that letter stung. It touched old bruises. But Joanna was right. Bruised is not broken. And shame is often just a weapon handed to decent people by dishonest ones. We started building the timeline immediately. Clara gave a formal statement, describing how Denise had limited my grandmother's calls, intercepted mail, and dismissed longtime staff members who questioned her decisions. The bank produced access records for the safety deposit box. We obtained a prior will from 2 years earlier that left the lake cabin and surrounding land in a conservation trust with me as executor, plus a separate personal letter naming me, the only one who still listens before speaking. That line made me cry in Joanna's office, embarrassing and impossible to stop. I hadn't known how badly I needed someone, even someone dead, to say I had not imagined the difference between Grandma and the version of her they were now trying to manufacture. The newer will was not just different, it was strategically different. It erased me with language designed to justify the erasure. That is the kind of cruelty only living people write. Then came the first real plot twist. Martin Keene, the family attorney whose witness signature appeared on the will, filed notice that he was withdrawing from representing Denise in all related matters due to a potential conflict of interest. Joanna raised an eyebrow when she read it. That man is running from something. 2 days later, we found out what. Martin's assistant, a woman named Elise Moreno, quietly contacted Joanna through a private email and asked if she could speak off the record. We met her in a coffee shop on the east side of the city, away from downtown eyes. She was nervous, constantly checking the door, but once she started talking, the words came fast. She said Martin had been uneasy after the will signing, Because Eleanor Holloway had asked twice during the meeting why Ava wasn't there. Denise allegedly answered both times that I was traveling and didn't want to be burdened. Elise said Martin later argued that Eleanor seemed medicated and unusually passive. He told Denise they should wait, she whispered, fingers wrapped tightly around her cup. He said it would look bad if there was a challenge. Joanna leaned forward. Did he say why he signed anyway? Elise looked down. Because Denise reminded him how much Holloway business his firm handled. There it was. Legacy. Reputation. Money. Always dressed in better clothes than the truth. I left that meeting furious. In a way grief had not yet allowed me to be. Not loud furious, clean furious. The kind that slices confusion away. They didn't just exclude me from a funeral. They didn't just manipulate a dying woman. They counted on old patterns. They counted on me doubting myself long enough for everything to be transferred, sold, polished, and buried under legal language. That night I sat at my kitchen table with every document spread around me and finally understood what Grandma meant by inheriting silence. In my family, silence wasn't peace, it was infrastructure. It kept Denise respectable, Rachel rewarded, Peter comfortable, and everyone else obedient. I had mistaken my refusal to fight for moral restraint. But sometimes refusing to fight just means making life easier for the people who harmed you. The court hearing to freeze the estate distributions was set for the following Thursday. I barely slept the week leading up to it. Every childhood memory seemed to return at once, not sweetly but sharply, like evidence. My 10th birthday when Denise gave Rachel a gold bracelet because she was old enough to care for jewelry, and handed me a journal because she thought I was the introspective type. The time Grandma took me aside afterward and whispered, "People give you what reflects how they want to see you, not who you are." Or high school graduation when Uncle Peter told everyone Rachel would be the family face, while I would probably do something steady and quiet. I became a public school art teacher later, then a store manager when layoffs hit, steady and quiet. They had decided what I was before I ever got the chance to surprise them. On the morning of the hearing, I saw my family in the courthouse lobby for the first time since Grandma's house. Denise wore navy wool and pearls, like she was attending a board meeting, not a proceeding about whether she manipulated her dying mother. Rachel stood beside her in pale gray, chin lifted too high, confidence stretched over panic. Peter looked annoyed more than anything, like being forced into accountability had ruined his schedule. Denise's gaze landed on me and slid over my black coat, my flat shoes, my cheap handbag, taking inventory, as though appearances still meant victory. "This is unnecessary," she said softly when I passed. Joanna answered before I could. That's usually what people say when scrutiny arrives too early for their liking. I would have loved her for that even if she hadn't been my lawyer. Inside, the judge reviewed the motions, the letters, the trust, the bank records. He listened without visible reaction, until Joanna introduced Clara's declaration and Eleanor's handwritten note warning against any will that portrayed me as emotionally distant. Denise's attorney objected to relevance. The judge looked over his glasses and said, "Counsel, when a deceased testator appears to anticipate manipulation of narrative, that is very much relevant." I almost stopped breathing. Denise's face changed then, just slightly, but enough. For the first time since this began, she looked not offended, not inconvenienced, but afraid. By the end of the hearing, the judge ordered a temporary freeze on major estate transfers, allowed limited discovery into Eleanor's medical records and communications, and set a review date for witness testimony. It wasn't final. It wasn't triumph. But it was oxygen. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't there yet. This wasn't that kind of family. Our scandals had money, not fame, but emotional scandals rarely need cameras to do damage. Rachel caught up with me near the steps. "Do you know what you're doing to this family?" she hissed. I turned to face her. That's rich, coming from someone who smiled in Grandma's dining room with champagne after a funeral I wasn't told about. Rachel's eyes flashed. "You think Grandma loved you more because you played the poor wounded granddaughter? She pitied you, Ava, that's all." For a second, old pain rose so fast it nearly stole my words. Then I saw it, the desperation underneath her cruelty. Rachel didn't hate me because I was weak. She hated me because somewhere, deep down, she knew Grandma saw through her. "No," I said quietly. What she felt for me wasn't pity. That's why this scares you. If you've ever known the difference between being tolerated and being truly loved, then you know why some people spend years trying to rewrite other people's memories. Keep listening, because this is where the truth stopped being private and started getting expensive. That afternoon, Joanna called me with one more update. Martin Keene had agreed to a deposition. Not voluntary exactly, but no longer resisting. He's cracking, she said. Men like that don't suddenly grow consciences. They just start calculating where the collapse will land. I looked out at the river beyond my apartment window, gray and cold and moving anyway. Good, I said. Let it land where it belongs. But I still had no idea that the worst betrayal in the Holloway family wasn't Denise. It was my Faith. You can prepare yourself for greed. You can brace for insult. You can even survive the slow poison of being treated like less than. But nothing quite compares to discovering that the one person you excused all your life was never neutral at all. My father, Thomas Holloway, had spent years mastering the art of passive love. He was never cruel the way Denise was cruel. He didn't humiliate me at dinner, or speak over me, or compare me to Rachel with that polished little smile. He did something quieter. He watched. He deferred. He let things happen. After my mother died, he drowned himself in work, wine, and whatever exhausted tenderness he had left for the world. I learned young not to ask too much from him because disappointment is easier to survive when you can blame absence instead of choice. But during discovery, Joanna subpoenaed family financial records connected to Eleanor's care and property management, and buried inside those records was a set of transfers from Grandma's personal accounts into a shell consulting firm that traced back, eventually, to my father. At first I told myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe he had been repaying expenses. Maybe Denise had used his name. Maybe this was exactly the kind of confusion that happens when wealthy families hide basic truth inside complicated paperwork. But Joanna's face when she called me told me not to reach for hope too quickly. "Ava," she said gently, "I need you to come in." Her office was quiet when I arrived. Too quiet. She laid out the transfers, one by one. Then a consulting agreement, supposedly signed by Eleanor, authorizing my father to manage strategic asset restructuring, tied to the lake cabin property. I stared at the signature line. "That's not hers," I whispered. It wasn't even a question. Grandma signed with force, the pen cutting slightly downward through the last letters of her name. This signature was hesitant, shaky, imitative. Joanna nodded. "We had a preliminary handwriting comparison done. It raises serious concerns." My mouth went dry. "My father knew?" Joanna held my gaze. "Your father benefited." I drove straight to his apartment without calling first. He had downsized after years of pretending not to see how much Denise controlled the family orbit, moving into a quiet building near the marina where everything smelled faintly of salt and old carpet. When he opened the door, he looked startled, then tired, then something worse. Guilty. That was all the answer I needed, but I walked inside anyway because part of me still wanted the lie to be smaller than the truth. "Tell me it isn't what it looks like," I said. He sat down slowly in the armchair by the window, hands braced on his knees like a man preparing for impact. "Ava." That one word nearly undid me. "No," I said. "You do not get to start with my name like that. Did you know Denise was moving Grandma's money?" He rubbed a hand over his face. "Things were complicated." I laughed then. A terrible sound that didn't feel like mine. Complicated is forgetting a birthday. Complicated is a bad divorce. This is theft. He flinched. Good. Let him. At first he tried the familiar language of weak men in expensive families. It was temporary. Denise said it was for tax restructuring. Your grandmother was increasingly difficult. We intended to make everything right later. But every sentence only stripped him further. And then, because he was too tired or too ashamed to keep managing the lie, he finally said the real thing. I was in debt. The room went still. He told me a development deal he entered 3 years earlier had gone bad, worse than anyone knew. He had borrowed to cover losses, then borrowed again to conceal those losses. Denise found out and offered to help solve it, if he supported changes to Eleanor's estate plan and stayed quiet about the asset transfers. He insisted he never meant for it to go this far. Men always say that when the cliff they helped build finally drops away beneath them. Did Grandma know? I asked. He looked down. Toward the end, I think she suspected enough to stop trusting anyone. I felt something inside me crack in a place I had protected even from myself. And you still let them keep me from her. He didn't deny it. That was somehow the worst part. I thought involving you would make it uglier. I stared at him. It was already ugly. You just didn't want it ugly for you. Tears came then, hot and humiliating, and impossible to stop. She asked for me, didn't she? He closed his eyes. 1 beat, 2. Yes. My whole body went cold. All this time there had still been a child inside me wanting some softer explanation, some misunderstanding, some tragic confusion. But there it was. Simple and brutal. My grandmother asked for me and my father let them keep me away. I stood up so fast the chair behind me scraped the floor. You know what hurts most? I said. Not the money, not even the will. It's that every time I told myself you were weak, not cruel, I was protecting you from the truth. You weren't just weak, you chose convenience over me. I left before he could answer, because I couldn't bear to hear one more apology built out of self-pity. Down in the parking garage, I sat in my car shaking so hard I couldn't turn the key. Grief is strange that way. It rarely arrives cleanly. One betrayal opens the door for old betrayals to come rushing in behind it. Suddenly I wasn't just 32. I was 13, waiting in the school auditorium for my father to show up to the art showcase Grandma never missed. I was 19, calling home from college after making Dean's List, and hearing him say he'd call back, then never doing it. I was 27, freshly heartbroken after an engagement ended, listening to Denise explain at Thanksgiving that some women just weren't easy to build a life with. And through all of it, my father sat nearby, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just allowing. Silence really had been the family inheritance. I called Joanna from the garage. He knew, I said, and she understood immediately. There was no need to explain. Come in tomorrow, she said. We'll amend the filings. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel. I don't know how to do this and not break apart. Her voice softened in a way it rarely did. Ava, breaking apart and telling the truth are not the same thing. Sometimes you do both. Then you rebuild with better material. I wrote that down later because some sentences arrive in your life like tools. The amended petition changed everything. What had been a probate challenge now widened toward financial misconduct, undue influence, possible forgery, and concealment. Suddenly, the case wasn't about one suspicious will. It was about a family system built on siphoning from a dying woman while isolating the one relative most likely to question them. Rachel called me that night, furious, then pleading, then furious again. You're destroying Dad, she said. I almost couldn't believe the audacity. No, I answered, voice strangely calm. Your father and mine did that together, one decision at a time. She started crying then, real crying, messy and shocked. And for one weak moment, I almost comforted her. Old habits die hard. But pain does not erase accountability, and I was finally learning the difference. If you're still here, thank you. I mean that sincerely. Stories like this are hard to tell because the villains don't always look monstrous. Sometimes they look tired, respectable, well-spoken, and family-shaped. If this is bringing up something in you, leave a comment with what part hits hardest. Your honesty may help someone else feel less alone. 3 nights later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a leather-bound planner that belonged to Grandma, one I recognized instantly from the way she tucked pressed flowers into the back pocket. Most of the pages were ordinary appointments, recipes, bridge club notes, doctor visits. Then, on an entry dated 7 weeks before her death, she had written one sentence in sharp, angry pen. Thomas is not helpless. Denise is not protecting me. They are circling. My breath caught. Tucked into the planner was a second note, written on the back of an old luncheon invitation. Look at the boathouse deed. Not the cabin. The boathouse. There was no signature, but I knew Clara's careful hand when I saw it. She had found something else and sent it without calling. probably because she already knew by now that phones in the Holloway world were not instruments of truth. I thought the will was the fight. I was wrong. The will was only the curtain. Behind it was land, money, and a secret my family had been burying for 23 years. When most people think of inheritance, they imagine houses, jewelry, cash, maybe a bitter courtroom argument over who gets what. But the most dangerous inheritance in my family wasn't property. It was narrative. Who belonged? Who mattered? Who could be rewritten if their existence became inconvenient? Clara's note about the boathouse deed sounded almost absurd at first, like the kind of errand grief invents to keep itself busy. But by then, I had learned not to dismiss the things my grandmother hid in plain sight. The lake cabin property had always been described as one asset, one long stretch of land with the main house, the cabin, the boathouse, and the narrow strip of shoreline that connected them. But when Joanna's title researcher pulled historical records, we discovered the boathouse parcel had once been deeded separately, not recently, decades ago. And for 11 months in the year I was 9, that parcel had been placed in trust under a name I had never heard before, Mara L. Quinn. I stared at the document on Joanna's conference table, certain I was missing something obvious. "Who is Mara Quinn?" I asked. Joanna shook her head. "No idea yet. But whoever she was, your grandmother transferred the parcel into a revocable trust linked to her, then back into the larger family property not long after." I looked again at the dates and felt my skin prickle. The trust existed the same year my mother died. That timing was too sharp to be accidental. Joanna noticed my expression. "What are you thinking?" I swallowed. "I think my family buried more than just financial theft." She didn't argue. The trail led to a retired real estate clerk in Astoria, then an old probate filing so thin and obscure, it might have stayed lost forever if no one knew what name to pull. Mara L. Quinn had died at 28 in a boating accident. She had no listed spouse, one minor child whose name was sealed in the record, and an attorney tied to the Holloway estate. My chest tightened so fast I could barely breathe. "The child," I said. Joanna was already looking. "The seal can be challenged." It took a day and a half, but once the court allowed limited access based on relevance to the estate dispute, the answer sat there in black ink, waiting to rearrange my entire life. The minor child in the filing was me. At first my mind refused it. I read the page 3 times, then again. My legal name at age 9 had once been listed as Ava Quinn Holloway. Not just Holloway. Quinn. My mother had never told me. No one had. Joanna spoke carefully, almost too softly. "Ava, it appears Mara Quinn was your biological mother." I shook my head immediately. "That's impossible. My mother was Julia Holloway." Joanna slid another record toward me. A marriage certificate. Thomas Holloway married Julia Quinn. Known professionally as Mara Quinn, 18 months before I was born. She had used Quinn socially and professionally. Family records, for reasons I could already guess, used the more respectable Julia. I sat back in the chair feeling like my bones had turned to water. It wasn't just that I had another version of my mother's name. It was that my family had buried the woman she actually was. Erased part of her. Simplified her into something cleaner, quieter, more Holloway. I went home and opened the one box of childhood things I had kept through every move. It held photos, report cards, a chipped porcelain music box, and a folded newspaper clipping Grandma once insisted I save for later. I had never understood why. It was an old article about a summer arts gala by the lake, with a photo of a beautiful woman laughing on a dock, head tipped back, sunlight on her shoulders. The caption read, "Local painter Mara Quinn brings coastal series to Willow Creek exhibition." My hands started shaking. That woman looked like me in the unnerving way strangers sometimes do in mirrors when you catch them from the wrong angle. Same mouth, same eyes, same stubborn line through the brow. And beside her, half out of frame, stood my father looking years younger and far more alive than I had ever known him. I sat on the floor and cried so hard I scared myself. Not because I had discovered a romantic secret, but because my whole life, even in my grief, I had been handed a version of my own mother curated by people who preferred order to truth. Clara confirmed the rest when I drove back to see her. She opened the door before I knocked, took one look at my face, and said, "You found Mara." I nodded because I could not trust my voice. Clara made tea and told me what no one else ever had. My mother Mara had not fit the Holloway world. She was talented, emotional, brilliant, and impossible to manage. She painted late into the night, forgot dinner parties, hated performative philanthropy, and once told Denise to stop speaking about charity like it was a fashion accessory. Grandma loved her fiercely for it. Denise hated her almost on sight. "Your mother made that family feel seen in ways they didn't enjoy," Clara said. She had a way of saying the true thing before anyone had time to dress it up. After Mara died in the boating accident, Denise pushed to reframe her completely. Less artist, more wife. Less inconvenient, more tragic. The family closed ranks. Old canvases disappeared. Her maiden name vanished from conversation. "And the boathouse?" I asked. Clara looked out the window before answering. "That was supposed to be left to you. Your grandmother wanted a studio there one day in your mother's memory. Denise fought it." I didn't know whether I was more devastated or more furious. The boathouse parcel had been tied to my mother, then quietly reabsorbed into family property after her death so the tribute could never happen. Grandma had tried to preserve something for me, not just land, but lineage, a space connected to who my mother truly was. Denise had likely spent decades making sure that story never lived long enough to threaten her version of the family. Suddenly the will, the funeral exclusion, the emotional distance language, all of it made even uglier sense. This wasn't just about money. It was about controlling which women in the family got remembered with dignity, and which ones got rewritten into softness, instability, or silence. I took the photo clipping and the court record to my father. He let me in without argument this time because he probably knew resistance was useless now. I laid the documents on his table. "Why didn't you ever tell me who she was?" He stared at the clipping for a long moment before answering. "Because every time I looked at you, I saw her. And after she died, I didn't know how to survive that. I waited, but there was more. There always is. Denise said it would be easier for you if we simplified things, that too much history would confuse you." I almost laughed. "Simplified? You mean erased?" He rubbed his face. "I was grieving." "So was I snapped. "I was 9. He had no answer. And maybe there isn't an answer big enough for that kind of theft. He finally whispered, "Your grandmother kept fighting for your mother. I just stopped." I looked at him and saw a man who had spent 2 decades turning away from pain until turning away became his whole personality. That night, for the first time, I dreamed of my mother not as a blurred figure in old family albums but as someone vivid, paint under her fingernails, wind in her hair, laughing too loud for Denise's taste. I woke with tears on my face and a certainty in my chest. I was not just fighting for a fair will anymore. I was fighting for the women in my family who had been reduced until they were easier to manage. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you from the heart. And I'd love to hear from you. Which hurts more in your opinion? Losing something valuable, or realizing someone stole part of your story before you were old enough to defend it? Your thoughts truly matter to me. 3 days later, Joanna received the forensic review on the consulting agreement and the disputed will signature. Both showed strong indicators of non-authentic authorship. Not absolute yet, but enough to escalate. And then the final blow landed. Elise, Martin Keene's former assistant, turned over a scan of an internal memo he had drafted and never sent. In it, he wrote that Eleanor Holloway appeared to be under sustained familial pressure, that Denise Holloway requested wording minimizing Ava Holloway's standing, and that Thomas Holloway verbally assented to revision strategy despite visible reluctance. Visible reluctance. That phrase stayed with me because it was my father distilled into 5 miserable syllables. Present. Aware. Reluctant. Compliant. The review hearing was now set for public court. Discovery would open wider. Witnesses would testify. And the Holloways, a family that built itself on privacy, old reputation, and carefully curated grief, were about to have everything dragged into daylight. But even then, I still didn't know my grandmother had left one final act waiting for all of us. One that no lawyer, no judge, and certainly no one in my family saw coming. The courtroom was fuller than I expected on the morning of the review hearing. Not because the Holloways were famous, but because respectable families unraveling in public is a language every town understands. A few local reporters sat in the back. Two women from the Historical Society whispered to each other near the aisle. Even the clerk looked as if she had already decided this would be the most interesting part of her week. I wore a dark green dress Joanna picked out, because she said it made me look grounded, not fragile. Not that fragile is bad, she told me, but today we need the room to feel you are difficult to move. Across from us, Denise sat with the expression of a woman still convinced that posture can win arguments facts cannot. Rachel looked paler than usual, the shine gone from her confidence. Peter wasn't there at first. My father arrived late and took a seat behind Denise instead of beside her, which somehow felt even sadder than if he had simply chosen her openly. Joanna opened with documents, not drama. The original trust records, the separate boathouse parcel, the handwriting analysis, Eleanor's letters, Clara's declaration, Elise's statement, Martin Keene's draft memo. Then came Clara herself, calm and dignified, testifying that Eleanor had repeatedly asked for me in her final days and had become distressed when told I was unavailable. Denise's attorney tried to paint Clara as emotional, disgruntled, overinvested. Clara looked directly at the judge and said, "When someone is dying and asking for the granddaughter she trusts, that is not drama. That is fact." I nearly cried again. Not because I was fragile, but because being defended without being diminished still felt unfamiliar enough to shock me. Martin Keene testified next, and if you've ever watched a man try to keep his reputation intact while his conscience drags him toward the truth, you know how ugly that can look. He began cautiously, hiding behind legal phrasing, memory gaps, procedural language. But Joanna cornered him with his own memo, then with scheduling records proving the will appointment had been moved up twice at Denise's request. When she asked whether Eleanor seemed fully free from influence during the signing, he hesitated too long. The courtroom felt like it held its breath. "No," he said finally. Denise's jaw tightened. Joanna pressed further. "Who suggested the phrase emotional distance and limited involvement?" Martin looked at his hands before answering. "Miss Holloway did." "Which Miss Holloway?" Joanna asked. "Denise." The silence that followed had weight to it. There are moments when truth doesn't need amplification. It just needs permission to stand. Then my father was called. I had spent days telling myself I could sit there and hear whatever he said without falling apart. I was wrong. Pain does not become easy just because it becomes expected. He looked older on the stand than he had in his apartment, less like a father and more like a man being forced to face the cost of every time he chose comfort over courage. Joanna asked about the consulting agreement, his debts, the estate discussions, his awareness of Eleanor's objections. At first he tried what weak people always try: partial honesty. Yes, he had financial strain. Yes, Denise had discussed estate options. Yes, Eleanor was sometimes upset. But finally, Joanna asked the question that stripped away everything else. Did Eleanor Holloway ask to see Ava before her death? My father closed his eyes. Yes. And was Ava prevented from knowing that? His voice broke. Yes. Behind him, I heard Rachel start crying softly. Denise stared straight ahead. Not one muscle moved in her face. That lack of movement told me more about her than any outburst could have. The judge called a recess after that. And in the hallway, Denise finally turned on me without witnesses to impress. "Are you happy now?" she said in a low, sharp voice. "You've humiliated all of us." I looked at her, and felt, surprisingly, no fear. "You humiliated yourselves when you treated a dying woman like paperwork and a granddaughter like a problem." Her eyes flashed. "Everything I did was to protect this family." I stepped closer, my own voice quiet enough to make hers sound shrill by comparison. "No. Everything you did was to protect your position in it." Rachel grabbed Denise's arm as if trying to hold back a version of her mother no one could publicly afford. That was the moment I understood something important. Denise had spent so many years controlling rooms that she had mistaken power for virtue. People like that don't think they're wrong. They think anyone who resists them is ungrateful. If you're still with me, thank you. Truly. Stories like this can be painful because they remind us that betrayal often comes dressed as duty. And if you've ever watched someone hurt others while insisting they were just protecting the family, I hope you'll leave a comment. Those stories matter more than people realize. When court resumed, Joanna called me to testify, and I won't pretend I was composed the whole time. I told the truth about Grandma's weekly calls, the voicemail after the funeral, the note in the folded will, Clara's letter, the boathouse discovery, my mother Mara Quinn, and the years of being slowly taught that my place in the family depended on how easy I was to ignore. I expected to feel exposed. Instead, I felt oddly clean, like telling the truth in full sentences had washed something off me I didn't know I was still carrying. Denise's attorney tried to suggest I was conflating old emotional wounds with legal claims. I looked at him and answered, in my family, emotional wounds were how legal claims got hidden. Even Joanna, who was not easily impressed, gave me the slightest nod. Then came the final twist. Just as testimony ended, Joanna requested permission to introduce newly delivered evidence from First Harbor Bank. The judge allowed it. The bank had located a delayed release media envelope tied to Eleanor's safe deposit box instructions, scheduled for release only if litigation over the estate occurred. Inside was a video recording. Not polished. Not professionally lit. Just my grandmother in a cardigan, seated in her sunroom, looking directly into the camera with the kind of clear-eyed irritation only a fully competent woman can wear. The room went silent as the clerk set up the playback. Eleanor Holloway's face appeared on the screen, older, thinner, but unmistakably herself. She spoke for just under 7 minutes, and every second hit like a bell. She said her health was failing, but her mind was intact. She said if this video was being shown, then certain predictable people have behaved exactly as feared. She named Denise directly. She named Thomas. She said she had reason to believe both were prioritizing debts, appearances, and control over her wishes. Then she looked straight into the camera and said my name. Ava, if they have made you feel absent, know that absence was arranged. If they have made you feel lesser, know that was their weakness, not yours. The boathouse parcel was always meant to honor your mother, Mara Quinn, and eventually to belong to you in stewardship if not in title. I did not raise you to surrender truth just because liars are related to you. I covered my mouth with my hand because there are griefs you can stand through and there are mercies that undo you. She ended by revoking support for any testamentary document not aligned with the trust papers and handwritten instructions in the bank file, and she did it with such clarity that even Denise seemed to shrink. By the time the video ended, the case had changed shape completely. This was no longer a suspicious inheritance dispute. It was a documented pattern of coercion. The judge's face had lost all patience. He ordered immediate suspension of the contested will pending full invalidation review, appointed a temporary fiduciary, referred certain financial matters for further investigation, and instructed that the trust and parcel records be preserved without alteration. Denise's attorney asked for time. The judge said, "Counsel, your clients have had time. What they appear not to have had is restraint." Outside the courthouse, reporters finally did gather. Not national, not glamorous, but enough. Enough for Willow Creek to stop pretending it did not understand exactly what had happened in the Holloway family. Denise left through a side exit. Rachel hid behind sunglasses, though the day was gray. My father approached me once, just once, near the steps. "Ava," he said. I turned. "I loved your mother." For a moment, I almost answered with softness. But love without courage had damaged too many women in our family already. "That wasn't enough," I said. And I walked away. That night, I played my grandmother's video 3 more times alone in my apartment. Not because I needed proof. I already had that. I played it because it was the first time in years I heard someone from my own bloodline speak my name like a blessing instead of a burden. And if you've ever gone hungry for that kind of love, then you know it doesn't make you weaker. It shows you what was missing all along. The ruling came 4 days later. The contested will was invalidated. But the real ending of this story still hadn't happened yet. Because once the paper was corrected, everyone expected me to take the property, keep the money, and disappear. They had no idea what I was about to do with the one place my mother was supposed to be remembered. When the judge's written order arrived, Joanna called me before I had even made coffee. "It's done," she said. And for a second I didn't answer because I had spent so many weeks bracing for impact that I no longer knew how to receive a sentence that simple. The contested will was struck. The trust documents were restored as controlling instruments were applicable. Certain estate transfers would be audited. The fiduciary would oversee redistribution consistent with Eleanor's preserved intent. Denise was exposed. My father was implicated. Rachel lost the easy certainty she had worn like perfume her whole life. On paper, I had won. But winning is a strange word when the prize is built from grief, damage, and rooms you can never again walk into the same way. The cabin itself did not become mine outright. Grandma had never intended that. She was wiser than that. She knew ownership can become another kind of trap in families like ours. Instead, the land around the boathouse parcel, along with a dedicated maintenance fund and a separate charitable allocation from the estate, fell under the trust I was now appointed to oversee. The trust language stated its purpose was to preserve creative and reflective space in memory of Mara Quinn, and in service of women and girls whose voices have been minimized, interrupted, or made conditional within family systems. I read that sentence over and over. It was not sentimental, it was surgical. My grandmother had seen farther than all of us. Denise tried one last move, of course. Through counsel, she proposed a quiet settlement. No appeals. No further inquiry into the asset transfers. No public release of the video. In exchange for my resignation from the trust and a cash payout large enough to tempt anyone who thought justice and peace were synonyms. Joanna read the offer aloud with a face like stone. "They want you gone from the one thing that mattered most to your grandmother," she said. "That tells you everything." She was right. I didn't even need an hour to think. I rejected it in 11 words. No settlement, full accounting, trust purpose will be honored exactly. For once, saying no felt cleaner than saying yes ever had. A week later I drove alone to the lake. The Holloway house stood quiet across the water, stripped of some of its old authority now that the truth had passed through it. But I didn't go there. I went to the boathouse. It was weathered, paint peeling, windows clouded, one side sagging where the dock had shifted over the years. And yet the moment I stepped inside, I started crying again. Not because it was beautiful, but because it had been waiting. There were old hooks in the beams, rusted hinges, a work table shoved against the wall, and under a tarp in the far corner, I found an easel with dried blue paint on one leg. My breath caught. It could have belonged to anyone, technically, but something in me knew. Some things do not need laboratory proof. Some things arrive in the body as recognition. I opened every window I could pry loose and let the lake air flood in. By afternoon I was sitting on the floor with notebooks spread around me, sketching out the first real plan I had ever made that felt connected not to survival, not to proving anything, but to meaning. I would restore the boathouse into a studio and retreat space for young women navigating grief, family estrangement, creativity, and rebuilding after emotional betrayal. Small groups, quiet residencies, scholarship-funded workshops, art, writing, legal literacy, financial boundaries, practical healing. Not a monument to pain. A place that helped pain become language and direction. I could almost hear Grandma's dry little laugh in my head. Now that, Ava, would irritate the right people. When I announced the Trust's first public initiative 2 months later, Willow Creek reacted exactly as small towns do when old money gets repurposed away from the old bloodline. Some people praised it. Some called it vindictive. Some said I was exploiting private tragedy. But many, many more women wrote to me quietly. Emails at midnight. Handwritten notes slipped under the trust office door. Stories from daughters excluded. Widows managed. Sisters erased. Artists mocked. Inheritances weaponized. And one line repeated again and again in different words. I thought it was just my family. That is how silence survives, by convincing each person their private wound is too isolated to name. If you're hearing this and something in you is aching, I want you to know I'm deeply grateful you stayed. And if any part of this feels like your own story, please leave a comment or share your perspective. Sometimes, One honest sentence from a stranger can become a light for someone else still sitting in a dark room wondering if they imagined everything. My father came to see the boathouse once before the restoration began. He called first, as instructed, and when he arrived, he looked smaller somehow, not physically, but morally rearranged. He stood on the dock with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the open windows, the stripped walls, the old easel I had cleaned and set upright. "She would have loved this," he said quietly, meaning my mother. I nodded. We stood there in silence long enough for it to almost become peaceful. Then he said, "I know I don't deserve this, but I'm glad you didn't let them bury her." There are versions of forgiveness people talk about like they are grand, luminous acts. Mine did not feel like that. Mine felt like weather changing slowly. "I didn't do it for you," I said. He nodded. "I know." He offered to contribute money to the restoration. I refused. Some debts should not be repaid with naming rights. Rachel reached out next, though not with the humility I might have hoped for. At first she wanted reconciliation language, family healing language, something pretty enough to post and vague enough to protect her. I declined. Weeks later she tried again, this time without performance. She admitted she had spent years competing for approval in a house where affection was always tied to usefulness, charm, or resemblance to Denise. She confessed she had hated me for being loved in a way she never understood, not rewarded, loved. I read her message 5 times before replying. I didn't tell her everything was okay. It wasn't. But I did tell her one truth. Being wounded by the same family does not excuse what you chose to do with your wound. She wrote back only one line. "I know. I'm learning that too. Maybe that was the beginning of something. Maybe not. Not every relationship needs resurrection to have meaning. Sometimes accountability is the most honest form of connection people can still offer each other." By late summer, the boathouse had transformed. Whitewashed walls, skylights, bookshelves, a long work table, a small legal resource corner with guides on wills, trusts, coercion, elder abuse, financial manipulation, and boundary setting. On the east wall, framed behind glass, I hung the old newspaper clipping of my mother laughing on the dock, along with a plaque that read, "Mara Quinn Studio. For truth, memory, and the women who were told to be smaller." The dedication ceremony was intentionally simple. No champagne towers, no velvet ropes. Clara came, Joanna came, Elise came. Even Martin Keene sent a letter of apology. I did not answer, but did file away, as one more artifact of too late conscience. And then, just before the first retreat began, I found one final envelope in a box of materials the fiduciary had released from the estate. Grandma's handwriting again. Fewer words this time. "Proud of you. Build what they could not imagine." I sat on the studio floor and cried in the late afternoon light. Not from pain this time, but from that overwhelming, almost unbearable tenderness that comes when love reaches you after death and still manages to steady your life. The first retreat at Mara Quinn Studio opened on a Friday, in October, with 6 women, 1 teenage girl, 3 notebooks still in plastic wrapping, and more quiet pain in that room than most families ever admit out loud in a lifetime. I had imagined I would welcome them with some polished speech about resilience and legacy and courage, but when I stood in the center of that restored boathouse with the lake shining gold through the windows, all I could say was the truth. You do not have to make your pain pretty here. The room changed after that. Shoulders dropped, eyes softened. One woman laughed through tears. Another set down the smile she had clearly worn in self-defense for years. And just like that, the place my family had nearly absorbed into another lie became what it was always meant to be. Not a shrine. A beginning. Over the weekend, stories unfolded in uneven, beautiful ways. A 47-year-old nurse from Salem spoke for the first time about how her brothers had pushed her out of caregiving decisions for their mother, then accused her of abandonment when the estate was divided. A college student admitted she had spent her whole life being the easy daughter because anger was never safe in her house. A widow confessed she still asked permission before making purchases with her own money because family shame had trained obedience so deep it felt like instinct. I listened, guided when needed, and kept noticing the same thing over and over. People healed fastest, not when their pain was solved, but when it was finally named accurately. That was the gift my grandmother had given me. Not money, not property, accurate naming. On Saturday evening, after everyone left the studio for the day, I stood alone by the dock with a blanket over my shoulders and watched the water darken. The wind had that October edge that makes everything feel clearer and more temporary at once. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my father. I drove by, saw the lights on. It looks like her. No manipulation, no request. Just that. I didn't answer right away. Then I wrote back, "It looks like me too." It was the first message I had ever sent him that didn't feel like reaching upward for love. It felt level. Maybe that was enough for now. A few weeks later, a regional magazine ran a feature on the studio, framing it not as scandal aftermath but as a model for restorative legacy. They used a photograph of the eastern wall, my mother's image catching afternoon light, and interviewed Clara, who told them, "A family can try to bury the truth, but land remembers. Houses remember. Women especially remember." When the piece went live, the response was overwhelming. Donations came in. Applications increased. 2 attorneys offered pro bono workshops on elder coercion and inheritance abuse. An art therapist volunteered time. A retired contractor helped reinforce the dock for winter at cost. For the first time in my life, I saw what happens when legacy stops flowing downward only through control and starts moving outward through purpose. Denise never apologized. Some people remain loyal to their own false version of themselves to the bitter end. She moved out of Willow Creek the following spring, after the financial inquiry deepened, and the town stopped pretending not to know what had happened. Peter kept his distance. Rachel wrote occasionally, carefully, without entitlement. My father came to one public event 6 months later and stood in the back, listening while a young woman read a poem about what it means to survive being edited by your own blood. He cried quietly. I noticed. I did not rescue him from it. That too was part of ending the old inheritance. As for me, the strangest thing about healing was how unglamorous it turned out to be. It was not one dramatic day of closure. It was paperwork, painting window trim, answering emails, learning when to rest. Accepting that some people would call me cruel simply because I stopped making cruelty easy for them. It was drinking coffee on the dock early in the morning and realizing I no longer felt that hungry, childlike ache to be chosen by people who had taught me selection was love. It was understanding that my grandmother's greatest gift was not leaving me something to own. It was leaving me something to steward. That changed me more than victory ever could. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end, I want to thank you with real gratitude. Your presence here means more than you know. If this story stirred anything in your heart, please share your thoughts, because sometimes the honesty of one listener helps shape the healing of another. And if there's any part you think could be told even more deeply in future stories, I would truly love your sincere feedback so these next stories can become even more meaningful for everyone who finds this channel. Now, when people ask me whether I regret challenging my family, I answer the same way every time. I regret the harm. I regret the years. I regret that truth had to arrive through loss. But I do not regret protecting what was real. I do not regret refusing to let women in my family be reduced into convenient versions of themselves, just so others could stay comfortable. And I do not regret learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop participating in a lie, even if that lie shares your last name. This story is only a story of pain if you stop at the betrayal. But if you follow it all the way through, it becomes a story about remembrance, courage, and rebuilding. Sometimes family is the place you come from. Sometimes family is the place you build after the truth clears the ground. And sometimes the inheritance worth protecting most is not land, money, or a house by the water, but the moment you finally understand that your voice was never too much. It was simply waiting for a place where it no longer had to ask permission to exist. Thank you for listening with such heart. May we all learn to return to our roots without returning to our wounds. May we choose kindness without choosing silence. And may we keep building lives where truth, dignity, and generosity can live together long after the people who tried to erase them are gone.